Welcome to our webinar, Data Governance is a Go, Now What? My name is Jennifer, Marketing Specialist at SenseCorp, and I'll be reviewing some of the housekeeping items before we get started. First, all attendees will be on mute throughout the presentation. If you have any questions about the content, please type them in the Q&A box and we'll go through them at the end of the webinar. As you're listening, if you experience any technical issues, please type those in the chat box. We'll monitor the chat and be there for immediate assistance. Lastly, we are recording the webinar and we'll be sending a follow-up email with the recording to all registrants. Thank you for attending today's webinar. We'll go ahead and get started. SenseCorp has been around for over 2 decades, offering a variety of consulting services across data, digital, and business transformation. Our team of skilled consultants offers insights and solutions to the most important problems facing business and government. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Alyssa Schneider. Alyssa is the Director of Consulting Excellence at SenseCorp and has over 15 years of experience leading complex data transformation projects for Fortune 500 to mid-sized companies. Alyssa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer. Data governance is a go. Now what? I cannot wait to launch into this topic with you all today. In my mind, this is where the fun really begins. This is where the rubber meets the road, where the theoretical ends and the practical begins. This is where success and results are found. My name is Alyssa Schneider. As mentioned, I've spent the past 15 years leading complex data and transformation projects in roles such as project and program manager, data and BI architect, and engagement manager for both the private and public sectors. I've had the pleasure and unique experience of standing up data governance offices multiple times over the years, both in private and public sectors, and also served as an interim data officer at one point. I'm currently working in the Consulting Excellence Division at SenseCorp, where I direct activities related to knowledge management, quality assurance, risk mitigation, and best practices within our firm, but I'm still heavily involved with our data governance initiatives, and I advise our practice area. Here's my sweet family and baby boy. And quick fun fact, I'm married to a classical concert pianist, so not the type that plays in bars on the weekends, but the type that plays with orchestras. So we have a great time enjoying creating and learning music in our household. Enough about me. Let's get to why we're here today. Data governance is a go. Now what? You've just gotten the green light. Your data governance business case has been approved. Now, where do you start? How do you know what to do first? To be sure that you build a strong internal brand for this work and that you're building something that is going to last. How do you instill confidence in the executives relying on you that you are the best person for the job and that this investment is going to pay off the way it was promised in the business case? I'm going to start with some bad news first. Data governance is not easy. And it's especially difficult at the start because it can mean so many different things to so many different people. You are just like the climber here, getting ready for his journey and contemplating what lies ahead. You might feel that getting to this point has already been an arduous trek, and now an even bigger mountain lies ahead of you. You first had to get the data governance initiative approved and funded, likely through a business case, and that wasn't easy. But through that work, your organization determined a need for data governance, and you had an executive say, yes, we need this. Go forth and make it happen. And just like a climber getting ready for the high mountains, you are now getting ready for the next part of your journey. But the mountain that lies in front of you is so much bigger than the one you just climbed. And if you've even spent just an hour thinking about this, then you already know the types of questions that enter your mind. Questions such as, where do I start? What do I tackle first? How do I form the Data Governance Council? Who are the data stewards and custodians going to be? What systems will be in scope? What data problems do we tackle first? Do we have all the technologies we're going to need? How do I show value from month to month? How will the organization accept and perceive data governance? What policies and processes are important? How will I enforce them? How I would get everything done with my limited budget or resources? And your list of questions just goes on and on. I'm here today to share my plan with you, a plan that has been tested multiple times and proven to be successful. My goal is to help you feel confident that by the end of this hour, you can envision how this plan might apply to you. Getting started is the hardest part, but once you successfully get through the first 6 weeks, then you'll have more confidence, more executive buy-in, and more cultural support that will help sustain you on this journey. So here's our challenge. Show value in only 6 weeks. Why 6 weeks? Why not 4 or 8 or 12? Why, Alyssa, did you choose that number? Well, 2 reasons. The first, in my experience, it's critically important to show value early and often because people will begin to form perceptions of the data governance office almost as soon as it started. It's human nature, and don't expect them not to. Think about it. We all critique things in life every day, and the culture we live in encourages that. You can like posts on LinkedIn or Facebook. We read movie reviews before going to the theater. We post reviews of our lunch or dinner on Yelp to inform others. Pretty much every time we see or do something new, we critique it, even subconsciously. But apart from this, the times that I've stood up data governance offices, I find that there is a natural cadence that lends itself very well to 6 weeks. The set of activities I'm going to talk about today fit well within this window. And if we extend the time frame any further, then we actually start getting into another level of activities that are dependent on those that we're going to walk through today. My goal with you today is to focus in on those activities that are critical for your long-term success, but are often the most difficult to get clarity on right away. Just as you saw in that mountain landscape, there are usually multiple peaks in front of you, and you have to figure out which one you're going to climb and why, because the journey to the top is different, and success is not found on every peak. And 6 weeks fits nicely into the yearly calendar too. 6 weeks is half of the quarter. 6 weeks into a quarter, you want to have an indication if you're going to be successful. 6 weeks still gives you enough time to adapt and change if what you're doing is not working. And you get 8 6-week cycles every year. So as I share information with you today, I'm going to assume that a good amount of your time is available and focused on data governance. But if it's not, if you're still doing your old job while trying to now also do a new job, then you can still take what I give you and you can choose to apply it over a period of 12 weeks or some other timeline if you need to. The information and the set of activities will still be relevant to you. Now, before we jump into the plan, I want to be sure that we're all anchored and mentally focused in the same direction. What you see on the slide is the SenseCorp Data Governance Framework. A framework is a broad overview of interlinked items that provide structure and direction on a preferred way of thinking or doing things. It's not a methodology, and it's not a map of what we're going to accomplish in 6 weeks. My purpose in sharing this framework is to be sure that everyone here today understands the scope of what I mean when I say data governance. At this point, I am not focused in on specific data needs or technologies. I am truly focused on data governance as a practice exclusively. And I'll zoom into the framework for a minute so that you can see some of the detail. This slide shows some of the specific task areas that are tackled within each subject area. For example, when we look at organization in the top right, we can see that this is where the framework dictates that we should work on items such as roles and responsibilities, committees, ownership, etc. And in the bottom left, in the communications box, is where we see the communication plan and things like training accommodated. So now that we're all aligned on the context of our discussion today, let's set our goals for these first 6 weeks. Goal number 1, establish a solid foundation for the data governance office and the overall brand. Goal number 2, build visibility and define predictable communication patterns. And goal number 3, institute a business as usual routine that breeds excellence and business value. Now, what do these 3 goals have in common? Well, they're all communication and identity based. Everything that you will be doing in these first 6 weeks is focused on defining the identity of data governance for your organization and aligning the organization to that identity. Think of the data governance office as you would your career. You want the image or the brand to be synonymous with excellence and success. You want it to be highly respected by other areas of the organization because it's providing tremendous business value. And you want everyone at the organization to understand what it is. Everything that we will walk through today is to enable the brand, the perception, and ultimately the success of your data governance office. Now, let's unpack each of these goals a little further and look at the specific outcomes that we are after in our short 6 weeks. For goal number 1, the very first thing we'll look for is a strong C-level executive sponsor. And by strong, I mean someone that clearly understands the importance of their role and how their role will set the tone for data governance at your organization. The second outcome is a defined data governance identity, which I just mentioned. And then using all the information we gather from the identity work, we'll want to put together what I refer to as a purposeful charter. We've all seen way too many charters grow stale and useless sitting on the shelf, and we'll talk about how to change that and why we need to. And by the end of the 6 weeks, we'll want to have a year 1 roadmap in hand. For goal number 2, the organization needs to be aware of the data governance office and how to interact with it. We need to establish predictable communications and points of intersection within the organization. In these 6 weeks, we need to pay attention to branding. We need to get a logo and define some basic colors that will immediately help people identify anything related to the data governance office. We'll also put together a 90-day communication plan. Not a communication plan for all of time that has everything we could possibly do on it. Let's just worry about the first quarter for now. We'll formally announce the data governance office and the organization, and we'll do the work necessary to get data governance stood up, something I like to call day 1 launch. And related to goal number 3, we're going to talk about the importance of getting collaboration and communication tools in place and why you should publish and stick to a standard operating calendar and consider hosting informal office hours. Last but not least, we'll talk about the value of establishing a use case library and how that informs your roadmap, but also serves to feed your backlog. So it sounds like a lot, and it is, but rest assured, I'm going to give you the playbook on how all this is possible. Additionally, within the next month, SenseCorp will be releasing accelerators that you can download from the SenseCorp website that will allow you to do this work more quickly, and I'll provide more information on that later on. Now, before we dive in, many of you might ask if the approach I'm going to share works out for your industry, if it's going to work. Let me share that I have successfully used it in the public sector, the manufacturing industry, and the retail industry. I've executed this at one of the largest health services agencies in the country. And at the time that I did that work, that agency was not one agency, but was actually a consortium of 5 agencies. I've used this plan with a leading air conditioning and heating manufacturer that has a worldwide footprint over 5 continents and a complex technical landscape. I've used this plan with a building manufacturer, supplier, and retailer that had grown rapidly through acquisition and was in the process of figuring out how to consolidate multiple companies, get all their data and systems in order, and provide accurate reporting to the executives. And I've used this with a leading eyeglasses and lenses manufacturer that had a complex supply chain, both upstream and downstream, and had failed in their attempts previously. So if you're wondering if the plan we're about to walk through will apply to your industry and the size of your company, I believe you'll find it useful, very flexible, and easy to scale however you might need to. And I invite you to contact me after the session if you have questions specific to your environment. Now, what is data governance? I know we just looked at a framework a few minutes ago, and for most of you, you may already have a solid answer to this question, and it's very clear to you what data governance is and what it is not. The DAMA, Data Management Book of Knowledge, says that data governance is the exercise of authority and control over the management of data assets. And that's about as simple a definition as you will find anywhere. But I start with this question today because I've found that whether this question is spoken aloud or not, and most of the time not, at every client I've ever had, this is the most confusing topic on day one when we are just getting started. And it's more confusing than we might expect because we don't recognize it. It's the elephant in the room that oftentimes goes completely unaddressed. And the reason I believe we don't address it is because as data governance practitioners or someone doing this work, we live and breathe this every day, and we forget that others don't. Or we assume too much and we don't speak up when we should. So 9 times out of 10, when I walk into an organization for the first time, I'll hear executives at a strategy session using the words data governance over and over. And quite often it's something like this. If we can just get this data governance work stood up, then we'll have accurate reporting and be able to make better decisions. They make it sound so simple. We only have one thing we need to do, right? Data governance. But what they really mean is not data governance exclusively. In the context of accurate reporting, what they really need is a combination of data quality or reference data management or master data management, a problem that's actually a lot more complex than just the phrase data governance. And in that setting, it may not be the right place to speak up and tell your CFO that they're using the wrong words, but it is important for us in those moments when we hear that to try to understand why the other person or people think that they're talking about data governance, and then to try to consider the work we need to do to help shift the vocabulary over time. But let me be clear, we're not correcting words for the sake of being an encyclopedia or a dictionary. We need to correct definitions and terminology because that's the only way that the organization is going to fully understand the entire scope of effort in front of them. It helps clarify the roles and resources we're going to need, the way future work is planned, and the types of new technologies the organization might need. And so I always make it a point to call out that even if organizations are looking for clean, trusted, or certified data, that data governance is a unique component within a broader framework that also requires data quality, master data management, and reference data management. And in fact, this is so common a scenario for us at SensCorp that we've actually put together an entire body of knowledge on what we refer to as the Clean Data Initiative. Because most of the time, that's an immediate goal for a lot of organizations. They want to have clean, trusted data that enables every area of the business and allows for an efficient, well-equipped workforce, capable of competing against other more data-savvy organizations. But data governance by itself is not a silver bullet. And even if you stand up data governance exceptionally well, your organization needs to recognize that it will require other capabilities to deliver clean data or the other business value that they may be after. And this might be bad news for those sponsors that were thinking that data governance was going to be the holy grail, because the conversations and the scope of what they're trying to achieve might have just gotten a whole lot bigger. Okay, so as the old saying goes, a goal without a plan is only a wish. So let's get to the plan part. Our timeline to do this work, to stand up a data governance office, is 6 weeks. And now there are 2 core assumptions when it comes to this plan. Number 1, I'm assuming that you are already up to speed on data governance. You understand the terminology, you've been reading any materials you can get your hands on, you've networked with other people in the field, and you may have prior experience or you're working with a partner that does. And if that's not you, then you have a task to get up to speed, and that work is outside the scope of this plan. And the second assumption is related to the resources or the team size you'll have available to you to get this work done. Now, I have found that it's relatively unusual for companies to staff a data governance office fully right out of the gate. So I'm assuming that this plan will be executed by you and perhaps 1 or 1.5 other full-time employees. So this plan is designed for a small team, but again, it mirrors what I see happening most frequently in the market, which is organizations slowly dip their toe in the water and tap 1 or 2 people to go get this started and prove its value. And I believe this to be a natural evolution, so don't be disappointed if your business case only approved a few people right out of the gate. But It's also why we need to show value right away and be sure that the organization understands the full scope of what it means to have a data governance office. Now, on this 6-week timeline, I've labeled each week with a theme for the week that summarizes the main focus for that week. And it's not exclusive, but it will help anchor us as we walk through this. As we move forward, I'm going to share a slide for each week with you that outlines the weekly goals, the major activities, the key meetings for that week, and some useful tools or deliverables. I'm going to warn you that it might feel overwhelming, and I've absolutely tried my best to simplify the message, but remember, data governance is hard. It's not for the faint of heart. And it may feel overwhelming on the number of things that need to get done as we look at some of these details. But just like cooking a Thanksgiving meal, if you have a plan, you will get that wonderful turkey out at just the right time and everything will fall into place. Let's take a look at week number 1. The theme for week number 1 is identity definition. There are 3 weekly goals listed directly under the title. Also, you'll notice on the left-hand side, we have the major activities for the week, and on the right side, you can find key meetings and useful tools. Now, week number 1 is the most intense of the 6 weeks because you need to articulate and document so much of your thinking. So stay with me through week 1, and I promise it's going to get lighter after this. I also want to remind you to maintain a perspective that is focused on day 1 launch. What do we need to do to be ready for day 1, the day we make the formal announcement to the organization? We can't boil the ocean. We only have the resources we have. So when you start to feel that anxiety of, we have a million things to do, I say, keep calm and remember day 1 launch. We're just getting started. Now, the first goal is to get organized. And it's going to take you a little bit of time to do things like onboard your team, whether internal or external. Spend the time you need to define how you will work together for the next 6 weeks and what you're intending to accomplish. Next, you should find and organize all existing artifacts. So going into these 6 weeks, remember, you've just gotten the organization to say, yes, data governance is a go. And that didn't happen without some set of deliverables likely being produced. So be sure to review the business case for reusable content. In my experience, I have always been able to reuse material, and I would expect that you can as well. Be sure you know about everything that exists so that you can leverage it appropriately and save yourself a lot of time. The second weekly goal is to ensure you have a strong C-level executive sponsor that agrees and supports your definition of data governance. And I am specifically stressing C-level executive sponsor. Now, if you don't have C-level support, the chances of this becoming a false start escalate dramatically. And that situation, unfortunately, is not unusual. Sometimes data governance starts as an add-on to something else, maybe a large program or project effort kicking off. Sometimes it starts with one executive just being frustrated with their data and they point at someone and say, yes, go do this data governance thing you've been talking about so my report is fixed. But in both of these cases, it's critical to find a C-level executive that is willing to take on the role of executive sponsor. You will need to teach them what it means. It's not hard for them. It doesn't require a lot of time. Basically, they need to empower you, ensure that they agree with the vision that you're putting together. They need to announce this as a strategic effort for the organization. And they need to have teeth when push comes to shove and new things start to change old things. The third weekly goal is to establish your perspective on what data governance is and what it is not for your organization. Now, just a few moments ago, we went through a series of slides on getting some terminology correct, and I shared the story about the executive in the strategy session that kept using the term data governance, but really meant a combination of other things. And so as you start establishing your perspective, you need to keep in mind what conflicting ideas people in the organization might already have. And they may not even verbalize them, so it's incredibly important to use pictures and words and to clarify even the most basic of topics. Spend time thinking about your point of view on data governance and the organization. You are the data governance evangelist. Going forward, you need to be able to speak the value of data governance at every opportunity. So be sure that you spend time developing the data governance track that needs to play in your head over and over again. Now, when you think about establishing your point of view and developing this data governance identity for something brand new, we're talking about defining the characteristics that distinguish it from other things. So what are those characteristics? Well, that's where a framework becomes so useful for us because it helps us pinpoint those areas that need to be defined in order to have clarity and ensure value. At the end of the day, this is all about organizing, connecting, and empowering the organization to act in a new way, in a way that intends to capture value from data assets. So you want to think about, why is the organization investing time and resources into establishing this? What did the business case promise to do, and how can you get more specific? What is the long-term vision of what we think data governance will accomplish, and the mission? What services will we provide? Let's walk through a few examples of these identity-related topics. Now, how many of you have a legal department at your company or a sales department? How many of you have a data governance department? Well, best-in-class companies today have a data governance department or function under a chief data officer, and this is what you are trying to establish. I like to use a slide like this to demonstrate that data governance is not a program or a project that will start and stop. It's a core business function. It may or may not be part of IT or another business area, just depending on where you want to put it. But this illustration clearly shows its importance when it's paired with other functions like legal, HR, and accounting. And this is critical for the rest of your organization to understand. If you walk into a meeting with data stewards from finance or accounting, don't take it for granted that they know this. They don't know this. They will just think that this is part of IT because we're using the word data. Or they will think that this is some sort of project or program kicking off that's going to end at some point. I also like to use this slide to tell people that if we can execute data governance the right way and be successful across all of corporate America, then someday our children and our grandchildren will think of data governance the same way we think of sales and marketing departments today, as a critical business function whose value is instinctively understood. Another key characteristic of data governance is where it operates within the organization. I mentioned where we place it. You need to define how the chief data officer role, and by extension, the data governance office, fits into this broader organization. Again, this may have been defined during the business case, but sometimes I find that this can still be unclear, especially if organizations haven't fully committed via a long-term funding model. You typically have 4 options to choose from. Is the CDO role integrated within IT? Does it report to a chief technology officer or maybe another line of business, or does it report to the CEO directly? And it's okay if this evolves over time, but we need to have complete clarity on where we are starting and the benefits and risks to that decision. Now, when you meet with your C-level sponsor in the first week, even though you may not have an approved roadmap yet, it will be important to let that person and the rest of the organization know that data governance is a journey. In the beginning, we are scaling the mountain together, and it's going to take time for us to get to everything that is planned. Most critically, it's important for everyone to understand that we are, especially in the first 6 weeks, but really through the first or second quarter, establishing the foundation of data governance. We're pouring the cement so that the walls don't crack later on. You might use the analogy of building out data capabilities. We have to build the integration layer and the data lake before we can build the dashboards and work on AI capabilities. Even though everyone wants the dashboards and the AI right away, and it's not that we don't, it's just that you can't build the roof until you have the foundation and the walls. So painting a vision for where you are going is important. So in the absence of a roadmap early on, something as simple as a smart art image can help people understand the journey that they are embarking on with you. And as you're putting together your point of view and establishing these identifying characteristics, another facet is identifying the scope of what data governance will be authorized to do at the organization, where the focus areas will be, and what services will be offered. Now, during the establishment phase, you are focused on standing up the data governance office and the organization. You are figuring out the people, the committees, how these groups will work together. But then you'll need to expand into what the data governance function will do to show value to the organization. And for that, I like to use the DAMA wheel here to have an initial scope discussion with executives. The wheel makes the conversation easy. You simply introduce it to the executive, you explain where it came from, who publishes it, and that the slices of the wheel reflect areas of data governance that can be managed, monitored, and in scope. You explain that before you can actually get to these other areas, you have to focus on the circle in the middle that simply says data governance. This means you have to stand up the data governance office and the organization in the establishment phase before you can move on to governing specific areas of the pie or the wheel. Now, while you could attempt to govern and manage all aspects of this wheel, it's not realistic that most organizations can tackle all of this on day one or even year 3. So we have to prioritize. The majority of the time, my clients focus on the knowledge areas circled in orange because one of the key drivers for them starting on this journey is that desire for clean data that I mentioned early on. So consider using the DAMA wheel in your executive meeting and clearly call out what your focus areas will be in the first 1 to 3 years. And just as importantly, where they will not be. But from this conversation then, it's very natural to start refining the scope of what it means to have governed data. And this is probably the second most common question I get. What will we be governing? And for that conversation, I recommend putting together what I refer to as a visual scope map. Now, the goal of a visual scope map is to answer the question, what data is governed or managed by the Data Governance Office? The scope map is designed to show this. It becomes the visual anchor that everyone understands and how everyone gets aligned, at least at a high level. And every time I use it, I find that it puts people at ease because they now more clearly understand what we're talking about and they can connect it to their daily work more easily. Otherwise, this can remain very conceptual for them. And remember, we need to get to the practical to get to the results that we are after. We need to use real examples and concrete ideas in every conversation. For most of your data governance organization, you are talking about changing what people do or how they do it, or adding more work to their incredibly already busy days. And so it can be very uncomfortable to be on the other side of this conversation. So I suggest you figure out a way to make them be the hero in this process in order to ease this. But recognize that discomfort and do everything in your power to put people at ease. In these first 6 weeks, I always say that 80% of our time should be spent thinking about other people and what they need to hear from us in order to be in our corner and support our efforts. Now, this visual scope map was for a client that had a defined 3-year roadmap. They grayed out the areas that they didn't intend to tackle in their first phase, and they started by working on 2 domains. They identified at least 9 systems that were related to these domains and 3 business units. They also decided that the data types to focus on would be mastered data. In other words, their golden record attributes, so not every piece of data in every system, and related reference data. Here's another example that's a little bit different. For this organization, their focus was more system-based and less business unit-based since the client footprint was smaller and they intended to include all business units from the start. So they listed their domains at the top, their systems in the middle, and their data types at the bottom. And they also used some light coding, that light blue, to show the systems that were planned for conversion and decommission, since that was going to be a big factor in their work as well. And as a last example, this was from the large public sector client I mentioned. Now, they had defined 4 domains in scope and then source systems by agency, and instead of focusing on data types, we used this to highlight the business process we were looking at. So I show you these examples to demonstrate that you can use a visual scope map to highlight a number of different things that all help clarify to the organization what we're working on. From this point, I recommend that you write a governed data policy that clearly lays out the mechanism by which data becomes governed and what it means to be governed data. So everything that we've just gone through in the last 7 slides represent the type of information that you need to be defining and documenting when it comes to building the identity of your data governance organization. And the examples I shared are not exhaustive. There's actually a lot more, but they are representative of the type of work that needs to be done. The theme for week number 2 is define the players. And I've provided you 3 goals specific to this week. The first goal is to clearly define the organizational structures that you will be standing up and the key stakeholders. Now, when I say organizational structures, I'm referring to committees such as the Data Council, the Executive Sponsors Committee, working groups, etc. So this is organizational design work. You'll be leveraging decisions you already made, such as whether data governance at your organization is designed to be decentralized or federated, Basically, how much responsibility for decision-making is held by the data governance office versus being pushed down to the business units themselves. You might need to look at how data governance intersects with existing committees like architecture review boards or project management offices. And I'd recommend having conversations with the leaders of those groups. Find out how the current lack of data governance affects them. Share your ideas on where you might be headed and ask them for input. The second goal is to document roles and responsibilities. And let me put some context around this because this is usually a pretty dry topic, even for a data governance practitioner. We looked at a definition of data governance earlier that stated that data governance is the exercise of authority and control over the management of data assets. So, how does this management of data assets actually happen? Well, it rests solely on the resources that manage those efforts. So with this perspective in mind, one could contend then that it's not the data itself that is being governed, but rather the people's behavior associated with the data. So let that sink in for a minute. How do we manage data assets? Yes, we're going to define a lot of policies, standards, and processes through this work, but ultimately the way it happens is by people choosing to follow what is defined. So I'll say it again, it's not necessarily the data itself that is being governed, but rather the people's behavior associated with the data. So if you think about that, does it change your perspective on why we choose to focus on roles and responsibilities? If we start thinking in terms of people and what our people need to make this successful, then it's easy to spend the energy and the work effort on the proper definition and enforcement of people's roles and responsibilities, since they are the key success factors to the adoption and preservation of data governance. And I call this out because I see a lot of practitioners go through the effort to document this information, but it's only because they're checking a box that says, must have roles and responsibilities documented. The point is not the documentation. The point is having an artifact that allows many people to fully understand and learn about their role. This document that you write will get translated into group conversations, HR role descriptions, one-on-one meetings, training material, and a whole lot more. Your role right now in these 6 weeks is literally to teach the organization how to function as an organization that respects and values their data assets. You have to teach them what to think about, what they're responsible for, and you have to document it so that we don't have confusion and collisions between people. Now, as you're putting together the responsibilities, also consider the allocation percentage of each role. How much time are you assuming people will dedicate to data governance work? What are your expectations and why? Once this is defined, you'll need to start working on stakeholder identification. You will literally, at this point, create a large Excel spreadsheet that captures names and data governance role assignments. For example, Jane Doe is the data owner for the finance domain. Her formal position title is VP of Finance and Accounting. She employs a team of people. She will designate data stewards from her department for 2 subject areas, GL accounts and financial reporting. And depending on the complexity of your organization, you may find that you need other types of less common roles, such as data steward managers, or one company I worked with defined data czars that had oversight on data governance activities within specific divisions. And to wrap up all this organizational design work, I also recommend putting together a RASCI. It's a commonly used project management tool, but it's very helpful for us. And RASCI is simply an acronym that stands for responsible, accountable, supported, consulted, and informed. And it outlines the key activities or processes that the organization will execute and how those various committees and key roles interact through that work. And I can't tell you how many times I've used this with executives to help them understand the purpose of the various committees and how those committees work together. So be open to using that as an aid as well. Now, I mentioned earlier a purposeful charter. And let me explain my perspective on the charter, because I think this is an artifact that is not well understood in corporate America by most people, no matter their role or their level. First, if you research the purpose of a charter, you'll find that generally there are 2 reasons why you would write one. 1, to serve as an announcement to an audience, and 2, to authorize the existence of something new and grant specific authority to utilize organization resources. Now, I've spent a good amount of time thinking about the charter, and this is because when I was first learning about data governance many years ago, I found this to be one of the most confusing documents I'd ever read in the context of everything that was going on and was trying to be accomplished. It just felt like this thing that had to be written, and everyone I saw doing it was spending a lot of time copying and pasting from things that they'd found online or read about. And there's nothing wrong with good research and repurposing what you can, but it can become very muddy very quickly when the overall purpose and intention of the document is not clear. And so I'd run across these charters that had already been written, and I'd find myself reading a document called Data Governance Council Charter. And it would start as expected with a purpose statement, and it'd cover some goals and maybe things like voting rights for the council. But then it'd pivot, and it'd go into a lot of detail about the entire data governance organization, areas such as data stewards, or maybe even data governance project execution. Or I'd find a council body that seemed to have 40 people on it, and they really weren't data owners. They were basically data stewards. So by the time I'd finish reading these long charters, I'd find myself more confused than anything about what this document was trying to do. And if I'm confused, as someone that is spending their entire workday on nothing but data governance, then there's no hope for everyone else that needs to understand this. And so this got me thinking that if we're going through the motions on this exercise but not gaining real value from it, then we need to refocus on what we are trying to achieve through the use of a charter. And so I've come up with 3 steps to success. First, figure out what you are chartering. Are you chartering the entire data governance function at the organization or just a committee? And please don't combine these 2 ideas into one document. It simply breeds confusion. I would suggest starting by chartering data governance as a function. Use a data governance charter to have the executive sponsor announce the fact that data governance is started. Include the vision, the mission, the organizational design, the different committees, and the intended services and responsibilities of the new function. It should specifically call out who has been placed in charge, the chief data officer or an equivalent. But don't make it more complicated than that. Don't let it get longer than 4 or 5 pages or no one will ever read it. You can then choose to write additional charters for each governing body if needed or desired. The charter helps us align and communicate within the immediate data governance office and externally. And if we don't write things down, we're not going to be able to adequately explain them. And remember, just like the roles and responsibilities document, this artifact is going to be translated into 100 different things: conversation topics, training material, onboarding material, etc. So as you think about putting together a charter, go deeper than writing just a dry document and collecting a signature. Really think about what the organization needs to learn and needs to start doing in order to be successful and make it purposeful. And so with that, we'll move on to week number 3, capture the value. We have 2 goals specific to this week. The first goal is to document business use cases that would benefit from data governance. Quite often I walk into organizations that have sold a business case based on a generic idea of data governance, and there might be 2 or 3 use cases defined that showed where business value might come from. But I challenge you to put together a long, long list of all the data issues you can find. Talk to people, send short email surveys, do whatever you can to find out as much as you can this week. And this work is not going to end this week, but you can use it to get started. Having a library of use cases will help you tremendously as you work to put together a roadmap in week 6. As you capture these use cases, be smart about capturing quantitative and identifying information about each issue, such as the amount of time spent due to the problem, the estimated cost, what data, what domains, systems, business units are impacted, one or many. Use an Excel spreadsheet, and you'll be able to easily sort and filter everything later. The second goal this week is to configure your collaboration and communication tools. Now, I am not suggesting data-specific tools in the first 6 weeks. Don't start your first few weeks thinking, I need to get a business glossary tool tomorrow. That's the wrong thing to focus on. I'm talking about basic collaboration tools such as a SharePoint site, group chat tool, video conferencing capabilities. You need to start thinking about how you are going to promote visibility, transparency, and communication within the organization that you're building. If there are already communication mechanisms in place that you can piggyback on, then that's great. But a lot of the organizations I've worked with have very little, usually not much more than a communications email address and maybe a weekly or monthly newsletter that might allow a video to be posted. And this is just not sufficient in today's business climate. Absolutely use it, but don't stop there. Most organizations today have Microsoft Enterprise licenses. I recommend utilizing those tools heavily or making the most of whatever your organization may be using. Now, if you do have access to a Microsoft Enterprise license, then I want you to make 2 requests this week to spin up 2 new SharePoint sites, one that is externally focused and one that is internally focused for your data governance office working team only. These should be group-enabled SharePoint sites so that you've got a group email address and calendar available to you. And then you should also you should also request that these groups be tied to Teams so that you can use the Teams app, which is a group chatting app. And so to give you an idea of what some of this might look like, here's a few screenshots of what some of my teams have done in the past. And it's nothing custom or time consuming. It's just simple and it works. This is an example SharePoint site with a very simple navigation structure. Again, didn't take much time at all, not very fancy, but it enabled data governance at this organization to have a virtual home, which is also a very important component of identity, right? Where does data governance live? Think about it. If you meet someone for the first time on the street, one of the first bits of information that you will learn about one another is where you are from or where you currently live. Psychologically, this is important to us as human beings, and it applies to data governance as well. We need to know that we have a digital home where we store everything that we need, and that's important to us. Now, here's another page on the site that focuses on capturing data governance initiatives. This client realized they had smallish things popping up regularly that the data governance office needed to solve, so we helped figure out a way to start formally tracking each one, almost the way a PMO would do, project management office. Besides setting up a SharePoint site, another key collaboration tool that you should leverage is a group chat tool like Microsoft Teams. And if you weren't aware, Teams is Microsoft's answer to Slack. It rolled out 2 years ago, and it's the evolution and upgrade path from Skype for Business. And so here's just an internal screenshot from our SenseCorp environment. It's our technology division group, and you can see that we're using it for division-wide communication and new employee introductions. Teams also allows you to voice and video chat. It's integrated into Outlook, and it has all the instant messaging capabilities that you'd expect. Another tool that you may use is Planner. Planner is Microsoft's answer to Trello, which is used for task management. And now all of the tools that I've shown you have mobile apps, so they're enabling people no matter where or how they might be working. And again, it's fine if you don't use the Microsoft tools. I've seen companies gain a lot of value from them, but you are free to use whatever makes the most sense for you. Just find something that offers this level of functionality and is easily accessible. And now that's the end of week number 3. You are halfway to our 6-week milestone that you set yourself. The theme for week number 4 is communicate effortlessly. And again, you have 3 goals this week. The first is to define the 90-day communication plan. This is not rocket science. It simply lays out the plan for what communication will happen within the data governance office, how, on what frequency, and using what mediums. Just figure out the first 90 days and you can scale up from there. Keep it simple for now. I recommend working with your marketing department to come up with a logo for the data governance office or organization and some custom branding elements like colors. This goes hand in hand with establishing the data governance identity. Everything that you put out needs to be immediately recognizable, and you'll want this in time for the formal announcement from your executive sponsor if possible. The second goal this week is to establish the data governance office, business calendar, and office hours. And I'm going to talk more about this in a second when I show you an example, but the key point here is to have this figured out. So if you want to include any of this in your formal announcement, you can. And that leads us directly to our third goal, which is formally announcing data governance, our day 1 launch. But before you send out that formal announcement, be sure that you've informally met with each person that you intend to be on the executive committee or the data owner council. No one likes to be surprised, and these individuals that are typically VP level or above need to know enough in advance so that they can field questions that their direct reports may have. Don't skip this. It is absolutely critical. Now, you'll want to write the formal announcement and send it to your sponsor in order for that person to send out. But that way, if you write it, it has everything that you want in it. You can utilize your new logo and colors. And in that announcement, be sure you direct people to Teams and the new SharePoint site for more information. You can be very creative with the announcement. Consider linking to a short video that people can click on so that you can share your excitement with them about starting this journey. And as I mentioned, you'll need to establish that business as usual routine, that calendar, so that everyone can get comfortable and get their feet under them. So let everyone know when you plan to host these formal meetings, and go ahead and establish a regular cadence for expected meetings and also for reporting. Consider holding regular open office hours and encourage people to drop in and talk about anything data related each week in an informal setting. In fact, I'd suggest that you bribe them with Starbucks for the first few months if you need to, just to get people talking and opening up to you. Now, the bottom half of this table is labeled reporting. And on the bottom row, you'll notice data quality review. Every month as things mature, your office is going to be held responsible for data quality. And in future phases of work, once these 6 weeks are over, you'll need to figure out the standards by which you will measure and then figure out what is measurable within your organization and how you'll do that on a recurring basis. On the top orange row, you see something I refer to as quarterly business review. This is your opportunity to publish a quarterly report that shows the progress your data governance office is making towards the vision and goals. And in this QBR, you need to be measuring yourself against something. Oftentimes, we see organizations measure themselves against an assessment framework that they've adopted, or a data governance maturity model in which they've already established what they're trying to achieve. You might consider utilizing something like CMMI's data management maturity model, or measuring yourself against the framework you've chosen to use, as you can see in this example. The measurement tool on this slide correlates to the framework I mentioned at the beginning of the session. The red spider web line shows the current state, and the thicker green line shows where this organization desires to be in terms of maturity and capabilities. So in the QBR, you can show your progress. Now, week number 5, engage the organization. And you have one goal this week, although it's a big one. You're going to onboard each level of the new data governance organization: the executive committee, the data council, and the data stewards. Now, this week is an important week, and everything you've done up to this point is likely to be utilized in some form or fashion. Your goal is to not only onboard and kick off day 1 launch, but to be sure that the meeting outcomes are successful, meaning that people are excited about this and they believe that this is going to help them and the organization. And here's a tip to keep in mind. Have you ever heard of We FM, everyone's favorite radio station? We FM is an acronym that stands for What's in it for me. Be sure that the presentations you put together cover this at a level appropriate for each audience. You'll spend time this week getting these meetings scheduled, meeting rooms booked, and depending on the size of your organization, you may need to offer 2 meetings in order to reach everyone. You should always plan to record the sessions and allow for video conferencing in case people are remote. However, if possible, especially on this first one, highly encourage people to show up in person. Now, with the rollout of data governance, you are forming entirely new peer groups within your organization that may never have existed before. And it's important that people meet one another and that they feel like a team moving forward. Focus the onboarding sessions on data governance fundamentals. Explain the identity, the role expectations, the journey to date, and what's planned for the future. It's probable that some of the people already have a lot of this information if you've been doing a good job of connecting with people up to this point, but this is your opportunity to share your vision for how data governance will run across your entire organization. It's the time to be sure that everyone is on the same page. So take your time in the meeting, be thorough, and try to make it engaging. And as a tip, I always recommend snacks at kickoff. It's a small way to let people know that you care about them, but it also sets the meeting apart from all the other meetings that they have attended in their week. And if you can, try to schedule 90 minutes. It's likely it's going to take you an hour just to get through all of the preliminary activity. And so if you can schedule an extra 30 minutes, I find it's a great way to get that group talking to one another. Crowdsource for use ideas. It's often very enlightening to listen to these groups discuss their data challenges and how those challenges may relate in ways that they didn't even know about until you got them in the room together. And when you meet with everyone, be enthusiastic about the future, and most of all, make it fun. Share your energy and excitement for data governance. It really does help, even if you can't tell in that moment. And if all else fails, throw in a Dilbert cartoon from time to time. You can trust Dilbert to make fun of clean and accurate data. Week number 6, plot the course. As you begin putting together your year 1 roadmap, there are a couple of activities I recommend you think about, including considering the framework that you're utilizing. What areas of that need to be addressed sooner than other areas in light of your goals for year 1? We did a lot of establishment work in these first 6 weeks, but you're not done. Be sure you plan time for things like the development of policies, standards, and processes, both for the data governance organization itself and for specific domain areas. That's probably a key area to tackle first, and you want to leverage your council for input and approval on much of it. Include strategic priorities for the organization. Be sure you plan for necessary involvement so data governance has a seat at the table when it matters. And there may also be a set of what I call foundational data discovery activities. It's not at all unusual to be asked to stand up a data governance office and realize pretty quickly that the organization doesn't have a complete understanding of their full technical landscape. And it can be like a wild goose chase trying to track down what systems and data even exist sometimes within the organization. So don't be surprised if it falls on you to put some of that together. Now, when it comes to developing a roadmap, don't get overwhelmed. The roadmap is nothing more than writing down the things you're planning to do this year and grouping them intelligently. You can reach out to a project or program manager in your organization that might have specific skills in this area if you need help putting it on paper. And I've listed some tips for you here. Leverage the business case. If a roadmap was developed, simply refresh it. Leverage those use cases you compiled. Sort them and organize them by category and function to find common themes. Research common data points by domain. Which ones does your organization have? Clarify your future state goals. Where are we headed? Figure out the gaps that exist today and what we might need to do to fill in some of those gaps. You'll size up each of the initiatives and generate a high-level roadmap, and then you'll get feedback on the roadmap, and you'll solicit help from partners as needed and plan to iterate on it. It's not something to do in a vacuum. Now, your roadmap may look something like this when you're done with it: a series of swim lanes with initiatives classified into logical groups notated by colored bars. What I'm sharing on this slide is a sample roadmap for an organization that may not have started their data governance journey yet, but this roadmap leverages the data governance framework as its logical groups. And so with that, you've reached the goal. It's been 6 long weeks, but you have effectively stood up the data governance office and organization. There's a lot more to be done, of course, but this milestone is exciting. Let's review our initial goals and outcomes list and what we've been able to accomplish in 6 short weeks. We established a solid foundation for the Data Governance Office. We have our strong C-level executive sponsor. We defined our identity. We have a purposeful charter, and we have that year 1 roadmap in hand. We built visibility and defined predictable communication patterns. We have a logo and branding, a 90-day communication plan. We've announced this to the organization, and we stood up the Data Governance Organization. And finally, we instituted a business-as-usual routine that breeds excellence and business value. We configured collaboration and communication tools. We have our operating calendar and our office hours, and we identified key use cases that will be a backlog for us someday. And now it's easy to get distracted by daily fires that always need attention, but if you can plan to do this work in 6 weeks, you'll be well on your way to establishing a successful data governance function at your organization. And as a bonus, here are 6 tips to ensure your success. Number 1, as I mentioned, spend 80% of your time thinking about what other people need from you, not the reverse. Block 4 hours every day to be heads down. Shut your door and silence your phone. Number 3, aim to produce a work product of some sort every day. I promise if you do that, this work will go by in a flash. Address all follow-ups ideally by the end of the day in which they appear, but definitely within 24 hours. Utilize your robust communication and collaboration tools and hold your team accountable to their tasks. And have a daily stand-up with your team to be sure that priorities for that day are clear. And finally, as I mentioned at the beginning of the hour, we are going to enable you with accelerators to help you in this work. We're going to finalize this toolkit in the next few weeks, and then we'll send you a link to download it. So please do that for yourself. Now, my name is Alyssa Schneider, and I thank you for spending the past hour with me. I invite all your questions, comments, and critical feedback. You can email me directly at aschneider@sensecorp.com, and I thank you for being here today. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jennifer in case anyone has any questions that they'd like for me to answer.
Yeah, so Alyssa, how would this plan change if the primary drivers for data governance are privacy and security related versus reporting?
Okay, so you heard me mention a couple times during the presentation, I used the example of reporting because I have come across that quite often. But if your organization, the primary driver is privacy or security, well, the good news is that these first 6 weeks really don't change for you at all. You still need to do exactly what we talked about in terms of standing up the organization, getting the right players in place. The only thing that's different is in terms of educating the organization, you'll want to make sure that you talk about what data privacy and security mean and how that interplays with what IT is doing today and legal. Thanks, Jennifer.
And then just one additional question. It says, at my company, we've been talking about data governance for years, but we just can't seem to get started. I don't think anyone agrees on the same definition of data governance, and it seems like IT just wants to make it an IT thing, but I'm afraid they're just focused on technology tools and don't appreciate all the people work that this takes. Do you have any tips for that?
Thanks for that question. So first of all, I'll tell you that this is not a unique situation that you're in. It's actually very common. So the question was, my company's been talking about doing data governance, and it's just like we just can't get started, right? And IT wants to claim it. Now, what I have found is that when an organization has trouble getting started, and I really dig down into the roots of that issue, what I find is just a general lack of understanding within the C-suite. Remember how I stressed the importance of that strong C-level executive sponsor? And my guess would be that at your organization, that person hasn't quite been identified, or we haven't quite found the right person that can kind of, dig into that issue and find out why it matters for them. Now, sometimes in terms of overcoming that hurdle, if the organization has been talking internally for a number of years, months, years, it can be very, very helpful to have an outside perspective and to have some external advisors. And when companies are making really big decisions about where to invest and how they want to transform their organization, it's really a smart thing for the executives to reach out and get some outside perspectives. And so, of course, SenseCorp sells services, so we're happy to help you with that. But I'm really just being honest here that sometimes it's not something that you can change internally without getting an outside perspective. So my tip then would really be that trusted advisors can go a long way, and we've really got to focus in on putting together a plan to find that C-level executive sponsor that's going to care about this issue enough to move it forward.
So those are all the questions that we have. Again, thank you all for your questions, and thank you for attending the webinar. For additional questions, as Alyssa said, you can contact her with her email address on this slide. You will receive a follow-up email with the webinar recording, with the links, and that toolkit that she had mentioned. Again, thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.